Welcome to the 21st episode of our show, The Second Sex.
Great to be diving in again.
Today we're going deep into a specific section of this really monumental work. We're looking at Part 2, Chapter 8.
That's the one titled Prostitutes and Hetaeras.
Exactly. And we're focusing quite tightly just on pages 680 through 701.
Right. A very specific slice.
And for you, our learner, this exploration offers, I think, a fascinating lens. You get these historical and societal perspectives on what's still a complex topic.
Yeah, and maybe some surprising insights from Beauvoir writing back in the mid-20th century.
Our mission, really, in this deep dive is to unpack Beauvoir's analysis of these figures, prostitutes, and hetaeras within these specific pages.
Trying to understand how they were perceived then and what their existence tells us about the broader status of women at the time.
Okay, so to start, maybe we should ground ourselves. Before we jump into pages 680 onwards, we need that foundational argument from earlier in the book, right?
Absolutely. You really can't understand this chapter, these pages, without recalling her core concept of woman as other.
Can you refresh us quickly on that?
Sure. So Beauvoir argues, fundamentally, that societies historically, they establish their own values by defining themselves against something else, something seen as different.
Nature, and by extension, woman.
Precisely. Male activity, historically, has been framed as the subject, the one creating value, pushing towards the future, transcending.
While nature and woman are often relegated to immanence, like being stuck in the present, the body.
Exactly. Subjugated, in a sense. So as we look at prostitutes and hetaeras in pages 680 to 701, we have to keep that power dynamic, that othering, in mind.
Okay, got it. So let's apply that lens to prostitution as Beauvoir discusses it here in these pages. She points out this tension, doesn't she?
She does. It's a real paradox.
On one hand, you might think, okay, maybe this is a form of independence, a woman controlling her body or earnings, maybe.
Right, that's the surface appearance, perhaps. But Beauvoir, almost immediately in this section, digs deeper.
Into the economic necessity.
Yes, and the societal objectification that's just deeply tangled up with it. It's not really an independent choice in a vacuum.
And she brings in evidence for this, right? I think around page 681 or so.
Yeah, she references that study by Parent du Châtelet from 1857. It's pretty stark.
What did it show?
Well, it drew a really strong line connecting lack of decent work for women, general poverty, terrible wages.
And the circumstances that push women towards prostitution.
Exactly. Beauvoir uses it to show that for some women, this wasn't just an option. It might have seemed like the only viable one, or at least better than the alternative society offered.
Which is, as you say, pretty damning indictment of that society itself.
Absolutely. It says more about the society than the women, in her view.
And she also takes aim, in this part of the chapter, at some older, frankly, dodgy theories. Lombroso, for instance.
Oh, yeah, she tackles that head on. Lombroso's attempts to link prostitutes with criminals, with some kind of inherent degeneracy.
Which has been completely discredited now, thankfully.
Right. Beauvoir firmly rejects it. She does acknowledge carefully that statistically you might find a slightly lower average mental level in some cases.
She explains that, doesn't she? Not as inherent defect.
No, not at all. She attributes it more to, the kind of skills or lack thereof required for certain specific roles within prostitution at the time. It's about job selection, not innate capacity.
And she stresses that most are normal, some even intelligent.
Absolutely. Her main point, right there in these pages, is that no inherent fate, no physiological flaw makes a woman a prostitute.
It arises from the social structure.
Yes, from supply and demand, economic pressures, male desire. It's systemic.
Which brings us neatly to the hypocrisy she talks about.
Oh, definitely. It's a major theme in this section.
The masculine demand creates the whole market, the supply.
But then society turns around and heaps moral outrage and condemnation almost entirely onto the women involved.
It's a glaring double standard.
It really is. And if you connect it back to that othering idea...
Society confines women to immanence. Expects passivity.
Yet it simultaneously creates and maintains these roles where women are explicitly sexualized, commodified, for male use. It's a deep contradiction.
And she highlights how differently things could be treated. A so-called fallen girl is dishonored, ruined.
Yeah, but then she points out how, in some circles or times, the affairs of married women might be treated with a sort of, indulgence. It shows the asymmetry.
Okay, so that's the prostitute figure. But then, within these same pages, Beauvoir introduces a contrast with the hetera, or the courtesan.
Yes, this is a really interesting part of the analysis around pages 688 onwards.
These women also existed outside traditional marriage, but their position could be quite different.
Very different. Often they had education, social graces, cultural influence even. Think ancient Greece, for example.
Right. They could engage with men on an intellectual level.
In ways that respectable wives often couldn't. They occupied this unique, albeit still constrained, social space. Aspasia is maybe the classic example she'd be thinking of.
And Beauvoir links this in this section to other performers too, right? Actresses, dancers.
She does. Actresses, dancers, singers, women who earned their own living through a craft. This gave them a more concrete, tangible independence than many other women had.
They found meaning in their work.
Yes, and here's a crucial insight from Beauvoir in these pages. For these women, professional success could actually add to their sexual value or allure.
Ah, so their self-realization as individuals wasn't necessarily opposed to their identity as women.
Exactly. In some ways, it could reinforce it. It's a different dynamic. She mentions Georgette Leblanc's view artistic performance as a kind of substitute for direct action.
How does that relate?
Well, it resonates with how a hetera might exert influence not through direct power, but through charm, wit, intellect, cultural savvy, performance as a form of agency, maybe.
But Beauvoir is still critical, isn't she?
Right.
Even with this apparent independence for the hetera or the actress, she points out the limitations. Still within patriarchy.
Oh, absolutely. She's very clear on this throughout pages 690 to 701. This freedom, quote unquote, has strings attached. Big ones.
What kind of strengths?
Well, fundamentally, even for the successful hetera or performer, their status, their value, is still largely defined by their relationship to men and by their perceived sexual worth in a male-dominated world.
So the freedom they find is freedom within boundaries set by others.
Precisely. Boundaries set by male desire, by societal expectations of what a woman is, even an exceptional woman.
It always comes back to that core theme.
Of women being seen primarily as objects, however gilded, rather than fully autonomous subjects,
Yeah.
even in these seemingly more liberated roles she analyzes here.
So when we look at motivations, as discussed in this chapter, for prostitutes, it often boils down to economic survival.
Largely, yes. That seems to be Beauvoir's emphasis for that group in these pages. Stark necessity.
Whereas for heteras, it might be more complex. A desire for a different kind of freedom, influence, intellectual life.
Perhaps. Access to spheres normally closed off. It's presented as a different calculation, though still within that limiting structure.
Which then raises that really big question. Beauvoir circles around here. Agency.
Yeah, that's the crux of it, isn't it? To what extent are these women making real choices?
Or are they just navigating, maybe cleverly, the very few paths open to them within the constraints of their time and place?
Beauvoir doesn't give a simple yes or no. She shows the complexity. It's about the interplay between individual will or desire and those powerful societal economic structures she meticulously outlines in this section.
So let's try to wrap this up for this section, pages 680 to 701. What's the main takeaway from Beauvoir's deep dive here?
Well, I think it really reveals the incredibly complex, often contradictory ways women have had to navigate societal limits, and how pervasive that concept of woman as other truly is.
And it's particularly interesting focusing on this chapter.
Yeah, how even roles that seem like a form of liberation, like the independent artist or the influential courtesan.
Even those are shaped and constrained by the underlying patriarchal structures.
Yeah.
The freedom isn't absolute. It's defined by the system itself.
Exactly. It forces us to look at the economic forces, the social forces that shape women's choices.
Not just historically, in the context Beauvoir is writing about here, but how those forces might still operate today, perhaps in different ways.
Definitely. So for you, the learner, digging into this specific part of the second sex gives you that valuable historical perspective.
On issues of gender, agency, societal expectations, things that are still very much with us.
It pushes you to look beyond surface appearances, to question the nature of freedom and the power dynamics that might be hidden beneath.
Okay, so a final provocative thought for you, building on these pages 680 to 701. How much have societal perceptions really changed since Beauvoir wrote this?
Specifically thinking about women's roles tied to sexuality and economic independence. Have things evolved as much as we sometimes think? Or are some of these dynamics Beauvoir identified still subtly, or not so subtly, at play?
Something to mull over.